Mike Muse is an industrial engineer, a music executive, a political architect. He breaks down the intersection of politics and pop culture. This is the Mike Muse Show.
What's up, world? It's your boy, Mike Muse. Welcome to another conversation of the Mike Muse Show. I am so excited to be in conversation with you all on this incredible Saturday. Yeah, it's an incredible Saturday. That's all I got to say, is that it's just an incredible Saturday. I am feeling good about how the week is concluded. So that is a plus. Before we do and get started, because there's so much unpacked about the week that was, can you believe we are in the final stretch of 2024? At the end of the year, it's always a reflective time. It's the perfect moment to pause and ask, how are we feeling? We've had Sunny Singh come on and talk about, health and breathing. We had Etienne Maurice come last week and talk about breathing and mental health. As we close out another year, let's just take a second to really check in with ourselves. Are we feeling accomplished? Do we feel ready for 2025? Or are we looking to do some serious reflection on this year's challenges? And there were some real challenges. I want to know where you're at. You guys always hit me up. I love the engagement. So I always want to just keep this two-way dialogue going. So drop a message on social media at I am Mike Muse, M-U-S-N-S-A-M-E, Twitter, Instagram, or Threads. Let me know how you're feeling as we approach the finish line of 2024. I'll be sharing with you some of my thoughts later in the show. We're all in this together, folks. So let's take a collective moment to reflect before we dive into today's discussion. All right, take a little breath. All right, let's get to it. All right, now let's talk about some of the critical topics that are on the table for today. I mean, I could have picked a buffet of topics that are on the table for today, but we're going to dive into Syria. Let's take a look at some of the economy and really the road ahead. So hold on tight, folks, because it's going to be a wild ride. Yo, let's start off by talking about Syria. If you've been following the situation, you know that the region has been in crisis for over a decade now. But what we're seeing today is a pivotal moment, a moment of transformation that has both immediate and long-term implications. We've all watched, folks, as the civil war has unfolded in Syria over some time. I mean, this changing of the Middle East is right in front of our eyes between Hezbollah and Lebanon has essentially been weakened. We see what's happening right now in Gaza with Israel and Hamas. Hamas is pretty much eradicated. Let me put that in quotation marks because you can never get rid of terrorist ideology. And then you see now what is happening in Syria as Assad's regime clung to power and as millions of Syrians were displaced or lost their lives. But now with the downfall of Bashar al-Assad's regime and what a downfall it was a quickening. We are witnessing the beginning of what could be a new chapter for Syria. It's a chapter that could either lead to peace or further instability, which is why Secretary Antony Blinken was there yesterday, really trying to create stability with our partners over the Middle East, because the situation is complicated. And I want us to really think about this, folks. Like, what does Syria look like after Assad? Like, what does a post-Assad Syria mean for the Syrian people, for the region, and for global powers? In particular, right now, there's a vacuum, and we know what can happen if a terrorist organization was to fill that void, militant groups was to fill that void. As of now, the rebels seem to be taking a more moderate approach, even as going so far as to say they want to help return and find the missing American that is there. Because the fall of Assad's regime is not just a political shift, it's a seismic moment in the entire Middle East. We're talking about a 13-year war, folks, that's, killed over 500,000 lives lost, and millions displaced. I'm looking at you, Iran. But what is left in the rubble of that regime? A coalition of rebel groups that are now seeking to create new government that has promised an inclusive, non-sectarian government, leaning into that more moderate approach, one that preserves the country's institutions, one that rejects extremist alliances, which is exactly what these rebels were fighting for, which is why they toppled the previous regime, and safeguards for minority rights, including women's rights. They want women to show up as themselves. The question is, though, can they deliver? How long will they be able to hold the line? And the challenges that come with that. Here is where it gets tricky. When I think about it, we've seen the global powers weigh in. We've seen everybody from Turkey to Iran I told you about Iran. Russia's the one who helped Assad, out of there to leave as soon as he did. They found no plausible solution. And the United States have all had their interests. And it's not just about Syria anymore. It's about how are these countries reshape the geopolitical balance in the region. For instance, folks, Turkey's role has been increasingly complex. While it's initially supported some rebel factions, it also has its own goals, particularly in terms of the Kurdish population. Turkey views the Kurdish forces as a security threat due to their ties to separatist groups. This would definitely affect the future of Syria. This is why, one thing that is to be said about the Assad regime, it was a constant. We didn't realize the tensions were bubbling the way that it was, so that it would happen so swiftly, but it was a constant. It's always that narrative, right? Like, you rather dance with the devil than the devil that you don't. And that's why Turkey was able to really understand, who they were dealing with within Syria. But now Turkey has to think about the balance and its alliances while maintaining its strategic interest in the region, which is going to be extremely difficult. Iran, another key player. For years, Syria has been one of Iran's closest allies in the region. Iran has used Syria in order to help, fight and be an antagonist against Israel. They poured money, resources, and military aid into Syria to back Assad and protect their interests in the region. But with Assad's fall, there are serious questions about Iran's future role in Syria. The Iranian government is already facing domestic pressures. I talked about this, yesterday on ABC, that the public in Iran is increasingly questioning the involvement of Syria. They've lost so many lives. They're asking questions of the why. With Syria no longer under Assad's control, will Iran continue to exert influence, or they will have to recalibrate? They're the ones who also, too, told Assad that they would not be able to come to his rescue, and it was best for him to leave, which is now he has asylum in Russia. And of course, there is us, obviously me in the U.S., while there's a broad consensus among regional players about the need for an inclusive Syrian government, the U.S. has a unique position, folks, especially with our focus on combating ISIS. Will we continue to be involved, or is it time for them to step back and let the regional powers take the reins, which is why Secretary Blinken is there? I personally don't feel like, let me change that up. I believe that Biden is more actionable to stay as a partner, which is why Secretary Blinken is there. I can't quite get a read on what President-elect Trump is going to take, because President-elect Trump and his base has been a very nationalist-first mentality, a nationalist-first, ideology when it comes to discourse. This moment in Syria, folks, is just so unsettling. It could go in so many directions because the stakes are too high. The idea was, how will Syria manage to create a government that reflects the will of the people with its rebel organizations being in there, or will it continue to be a battleground for international powers with competing interests? That's why I wanted to lay out all the different dynamics, at play when it comes to that. All right, so with that being said, I want to pivot a little bit, folks, to something that's just a little bit closer to home, as I was just mentioning the idea of Trump's very American first, this nationalist agenda, not wanting to help. I even hear it all the time, not just from individuals who are in the MAGA world, but really from so many Americans. They want to know, right, why are we sending money over to different countries? We have homeless here, our school systems are failing. And the answer to all that is yes and absolutely. But we still have to be in partnership and have these allies, because that's what keeps America safe. That really does have an impact on national security. A president has to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. The U.S. economy, President-elect Donald Trump has once again made headlines with this pick for Treasury Secretary. President-elect Trump has been making headlines, every 2 hours. I guess that's kind of a random statement that I just made. But I always forget that we're in such unprecedented times with his new pick of the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent. You might not be too familiar with Bessent yet, but you're about to hear a lot more about him as this quote 333 quote, end quote, if you will. That's his economic plan that he's really been pushing, 333. Here's what Bessent has laid out for the U.S. economy as his vision for the next 4 years, in particular looking at growth, deficit, and energy, which is, I'm really excited to talk about energy on the other side. But really quickly, let's kind of break this down for a second. First, let's look at the growth. The nominee has set a goal to achieve 3% annual economic growth. Just for the context, that is a goal that seems simple on the surface, but has proven to be incredibly difficult to sustain. Our economy has struggled to break out of the sluggish growth patterns for over a decade now. Even the Federal Reserve has lowered its expectations for growth. So Benson's target is ambitious, to say the least. Because the reason why, folks, is there are several factors at play here. The global economy is volatile with inflation and international trade tensions, and I read that carefully. Trade wars, which we talked about last week. I know everyone believes, again, like, make them pay, but that only gets transferred to the consumer, the people making the products over in China or wherever it's brought in from. That expense get passed on to the American consumer and the American shopper. So I think that is kind of something that's going to be kind of left out of this conversation. Additionally, there are ongoing debates over immigration policies that could further reduce the workforce and limit growth potential. I'm looking at the dairy farmers. They rely on so much immigrant work in order to help produce the amount of dairy that's needed for them to turn profits. So while 3% growth sounds nice, it's a challenging target given all these moving parts. Second, let's look at the deficit. This is where things get really tricky. Benson's goal is to cut the U.S. federal deficit to 3% of GDP by 2028. Right now, folks, we're looking at a deficit of $1.8 trillion, about 6.4% of the GDP. So we're currently hovering at 6.4%. He wants to cut to 3%. So if we're doing the math, it's a pretty big gap, and that's what we call the delta. How will Bessent and his administration balance tax cuts, which could further deplete government coffers with the need to cut spending? Trump is really planning on these corporate taxes, individual taxes, to cut them. When you cut them, how are these programs going to get paid, in particular when you're spending more? This is a real question that will take center stage as the administration moves forward, which is so interesting because, the Republicans are all about cutting taxes. But when you cut taxes, you have to realize the time and place that we're in right now. Like we're in a deficit. Inflation is high. Debt is in the trillions. So the biggest elephant in the room is entitlement spending, right? So Security and Medicare are the largest drivers of the national debt. And tackling these programs will be key to long-term fiscal health. But Benson and the administration have said that this will be a gradual process. I'm thinking about DOGE right now with Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy. What will they be recommending? Because we may not see any immediate changes, but the conversations around cutting entitlement programs will inevitably only get stronger, because it is such a strong Republican talking point. And President-elect Trump feels like he has a mandate. Next thing I want to talk about is energy. Benson is pushing to increase domestic oil production by 3 million barrels per day. This is a bold and aggressive target, folks, to do 3 million barrels per day. On the surface, increasing oil production sounds like a good plan to boost U.S. energy independence and create jobs. But the reality of the global energy market are far more complex, which I'm really going to talk about on the other side. For one, energy prices are increasingly volatile. The U.S. oil industry is already grappling with an oversupply of oil, and the further expansion could push prices down. This could also hurt oil companies that are already dealing with slim margins. Plus, there's the question of sustainability, the environment, climate change policies, and the global demand for oil all play critical roles in determining whether this goal is even realistic. So my man's 333 strategy is a high risk, high reward. As you know, the economy doesn't always follow the script. As we talk about like in football, is it scripted? And it will be interesting to see how these ambitious targets play out in the coming years. Will the U.S. hit our goals, or will the economic forces at play derail the plan? We're also hearing a lot about concerns of everyday issues like grocery prices. This is where things also too get interesting because of how President-elect Trump's approach to managing the economy. He is just not about cuts or regulatory reforms. He's also focused on what matters to the people directly, like the cost of food. Trump has repeatedly discussed his ability to lower grocery prices, a point that resonated really well with voters, particularly those who were struggling with inflation and rising costs under the Biden administration. He's made bold claims about bringing down grocery prices, asserting that with his policies in place, prices will come down and they will come down fast. He said this was going to happen on his first day on the job. He has a big agenda for his first day, by the way. But here's the catch: the economic landscape is much more complex, as we just outlined, than simply waving a magic wand. During his campaign, Trump had promised that under his leadership, inflation would be tamed and prices across the board would decrease. Folks, we know that's not really realistic. It's much more harder than it seems. He even went so far as to claim that under his watch, the income, your income was soar. Remember he said that? Your net worth was skyrocket. And all those amazing attributions and platitudes that he always speaks with. And with a specific focus on reducing the cost of everyday goods like apples, bacon, and eggs. But as we've seen, the reality is much more complicated. While it's easy to promise lower grocery bills, that's why I said we need more civics in schools. The path to achieving that goal is filled with challenges, folks. Trump's economic strategy has involved imposing tariffs on goods from other countries, as I've been discussing, is much more challenging because it impacts us, the people who are doing the shopping. And as we talked before last week about the impact of the great example that we use is about the farmers. In his first administration, when he imposed his tariffs, went to a trade war with China, China began to purchase their soybeans elsewhere, and we had to do a bailout for the farmers. So while Trump has expressed confidence that this will be able to lower the grocery prices, the reality is a bit more nuanced. He just recently did an interview where he acknowledged that he couldn't guarantee that tariffs wouldn't result in higher price for American consumers. What? Say what now? In fact, when pressed on whether his tariffs would lead to higher prices, he had to walk back some of his earlier comments, folks. He literally said, I cannot guarantee. That was his whole thing. He said, I can guarantee, while he was on the campaign trail, acknowledging that the tariffs could raise prices. But still, he insisted that his broader economic agenda would eventually result in price reduction. I don't know, folks. I don't know. But what I do know is that there will be more to come with this. There'll be more things to unpack because the catch-22 here is that even if tariffs drive up costs in the short term, Trump's administration is focusing heavily on reducing inflation over the long run. The challenge, though, is how to balance these policies, how to push for growth and lower consumer prices without triggering an economic slowdown, right? Trump's assertion that grocery prices will come tumbling down is much more difficult to guarantee, especially as we begin to introduce the trade policies that he wants to bring into the space. But I'm really excited. With all that being said, particularly I leaned into energy a little bit during this last few moments here because I have a really special guest that's coming up on the other side from McKinsey. I know McKinsey's been in the news as of yesterday. We're not going to talk about that. But I had the chance to meet this brilliant mind really looking at the hard things, the challenges that are facing us with energy and to really become having clean emissions by 2050 globally, right? But the challenges are going to come with that, in particular around the energy space. But I just wanted to say, before we take this break and you get something to eat, you get something to drink, and you come back, I just want to hear your thoughts. Let me know how you're feeling about these economic promises. Are you buying into the vision for a stronger, more affordable economy? Or are you guys skeptical about what lies ahead? Let us know what you think. Hit me up at I am Mike Muse, M-U-S and Sam E on Twitter, Instagram, and Threads. Stay right there, folks, and we'll be right back.